Jesus asked his beloved disciples to watch and pray. He needed their support. He didn't ask often anything of them, but this was important to him. He knew what was to come. He needed their prayers. And they fell asleep. As the reading says, how bitterly they must have regretted that lack of willpower. And Jesus' response was compassion. How could he do anything but just love them in that supreme moment of testing? And we look at that story and we can be inspired to feel that the hurts that we receive, let us respond with compassion, forgiveness. Let them be human. Know that the spirit may be willing, but the flesh is weak. And rise above those hurts with willpower by tuning into God, by wanting only that reality. And Jesus showed the ultimate willpower when in the Garden of Gethsemane, his beloved disciples asleep, he knew what was coming. He said, Lord, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, thy will be done. He surrendered his will to God's will perfectly. As we read in the Bible throughout his whole passion, he never got excited. He never yelled at the people who were tormenting him. He never said a word. He just accepted it. And that's often the way that God's tests come to us. They seem like a crucifixion. They seem as though it is the worst possible thing that could happen. How could there be anything worse than that crucifixion? And yet, for Jesus, an avatar, this great soul, bringing this enormous light into the world, his test was overcoming death itself. And he was able to do that. He was able to resurrect. Without the crucifixion and death, there would not be the resurrection. So let us remember that when our tests come that seem so overwhelming, that seem so horrible, like the worst thing that could ever happen, that somehow God's will is always good. There is always tailor-made for each one of us the pathway that leads to our enlightenment and our liberation. What we need to do in this moment is trust that and start to build our faith. And how do we develop that dynamic willpower that can say, Lord, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless, thy will be done. Let me unite my will with thy will for my own greatest good and all the good for everyone. Well, we can start by saying yes. I have a quote here I'll read from Swami Dharmadas, and I really enjoyed this particular quote this week, so I'll share it with you in a few moments. But if we can start to say yes to life, and Swami would often talk about this. He even named one of his albums, Say Yes to Life. The song's all about that. Instead of when something happens We get stuck in traffic. Oh no, is our first words. Oh no. Or someone comes to the door. Oh no. Or it's more serious things. The job, we get laid off. Oh no. But maybe there's a better job. Maybe there's something better. Something happens. We can't see the consequences. We cannot see beyond our little perception. But God sees the whole picture. Trust in that picture. And whenever anything comes into your life, say, yes, thy will be done. Help me through this. My will united with your will. We can walk this path together. Another important way to develop that willpower and faith is to look at every situation and see the good. There is good somewhere. In every one of these situations that come into our lives, there is good. Find it. And the same with people. Instead of looking at people and seeing the faults, seeing someone coming towards you and, oh no, it's that person again. Instead, say, oh yes, that person has this good quality, that good quality. Search. They are there. There is goodness. Look for that goodness. See that goodness. And always pray, my will united with thy will. I'll read this little story. These are words from Swami Kriyananda, and as many of you know who knew him, he had a wonderful sense of humor. And it was one of the things that many of us love the best about him. And his writings have that same little sense of humor, which I hope you'll be able to realize. Habitual unwillingness is a common human condition, suggesting to the mind endless mountain ranges of problems in the discharge of the simplest duty. For just as willingness draws a constantly fresh supply of energy to the body, so also does unwillingness block that energy. The greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. The greater the unwillingness, the feebler the flow of energy. We've all met people of such deep-seated unwillingness that when merely answering the doorbell, they heave themselves groaning and sighing to their feet, as if certain they were off to meet their martyrdom. The greater the flow of energy to the brain, also as a result of habitually willing oneself to think deeply and creatively, the greater one's mental capacity. This indeed is the simple secret of genius, an abundance of mental energy. The weaker the energy flow to the brain, on the other hand, the duller a person's awareness becomes. And this is the simple secret of stupidity. So let us try to have a greater flow of energy to the brain, to the heart. Let's fill ourselves with that vibration and trust in God that His will is for our highest good, and live in that trust.
This topic is "In surrender lies victory," and it's an interesting juxtaposition because we would tend to think almost automatically that surrender could not possibly lead to victory. Surrender means defeat. And in fact, I'm reminded years ago of a time when I worked at the Expanding Light, which at that time was called the World Brotherhood Retreat at Ananda Village. Later, Swami changed it to changed the name to the Expanding Light. And people would come from all walks of life and from many countries. But interestingly, we have this word retreat, and of course it has multiple meanings. It has the meaning in war of, it's time to get out of here now. We're not winning this, it's not going very well, it's time to retreat. And then we have the word retreat, to go on retreat, as meaning to go forward, to take a step inward, really. Well, unfortunately, the word retreat still for most people means that retreat from battle, or that basically that there's failure involved in it somehow. And we noticed that in other countries, Europe in particular, there is a much more positive sense. Retiro means retiring, means drawing inward, means going in a different direction, not running away from a disastrous battle. And here in America, people would tend to come to the Expanding Light when there was disaster in their lives, when they had hit crisis, when they had hit a situation or a moment where they simply could not continue in the direction that their life had been going up to that point. Something had happened, and now it was time to do something different. Okay, then they would finally come. But it meant that the sense of going inward as a normal course of life wasn't very well developed for most people. And culturally, I think we see that across this country. Other countries, it's less so. It's much more common in Europe, for example, to go on some kind of retreat, some kind of spiritual exercise, whatever, as a normal part of the maintenance of life, as a normal part of tuning in and going inside. And we would do well to tune into that part, because there is this sense that I know what's best for me. I know. Well, the trouble is we don't know. Or we don't know all of what's best for us. We know part of what's best for us. We know up to a certain point. I'll give you an example from my own life. When I was a teenager, I had various hobbies, and I had various activities that I was interested in, sports in particular, but for a time I played competitive chess, and I was actually pretty decent at it. I used to play by mail, which sounds really bizarre, but I would enter these tournaments by mail, and you could order these little postcards that had a little chessboard on them, and you'd fill in the pieces and show your next move to the person and put the postcard in the mail. And a game took 6 months to a year. I mean, we are talking industrial strength patience to be able to go through, now you can do it online, etc. Well, anyway, I had this overwhelming desire to be successful in something, and the first thing that really came into my life was running. I had been okay at basketball. In fact, in a bizarre quirk of fate, timing, whatever you want to call it, my freshman coach in basketball, when I was in freshman in high school, I was briefly on the A team, which was the better of the two, as you might imagine, and later got demoted to the B team. Well, my coach as the B team was a guy named Randy Fund, P-F-U-N-D. And if any of you are Lakers fans and you have a long memory, You may remember back to the early 90s when Randy Funn briefly became the head coach of the LA Lakers. And I thought, how many Randy Funns can there be in the world? I was living in Seattle at the time, and he got promoted. It was a little hard to recognize him. The picture in the newspaper was kind of fuzzy, but I did a little research, and actually a reporter did a little research. His previous head coaching job, the only previous head coaching job that he had, was for a freshman basketball team of high school, the B team. That was my team. I was like, for God's sakes. Anyway, so as you might imagine, my basketball career was relatively short, but I started running in high school, and I was pretty good at running. There was a time as a junior when I was ranked in the state of Illinois, which is where I lived, and then promptly got injured. Here's the interesting thing. That injury at age 17 was devastating, disastrous for me at the time, because I had run 300 miles in December. If you do the math, that's around 10 miles a day. One of those weeks was a 100-mile week, which means closer to 15 miles a day. I was really into running. It was very, very positive. It was very potent. The endorphins that flow when you're running, they're really, really strong. It was like, I knew this was, I wouldn't have perhaps used these words, but it was God's will for me that I was running. And then suddenly I wasn't, because I couldn't. And it was not a painful injury, it was tendonitis, but it was painful enough and persistent enough. I kept trying. I was really persistent. I rehabbed for a while. Now, this is long before the days of the kinds of rehab that they have now. I'm sure I might have been able to recover. But there was a divine twist in this. That chant that we were singing, "Thy will, not mine," did you notice the bizarre note in there? Yeah. Thy will, not mine, Lord, thy... It's like it stands out. And God's will has a way of hitting weird notes sometimes in your life. You're going along, and all of a sudden there's this note, and it's like, whoa, wait a minute, that didn't seem to fit. I can't even play that chord on the guitar. The chord that follows it is part of the chant normally, but that other chord, A flat, I don't play A flat. I can sort of play the guitar, but I don't really play A flat in sequence of something like that. Anyway, I wanted to keep running. I kept on trying to come back. Didn't work. I even tried to ride my bicycle, and that actually did work for a while. Well, then I was determined to ride my bike from Illinois to Minnesota in the summer. And about 4 or 5 days before that trip was to go off, I was going to ride with a friend of mine. We were going to camp along the way. It was going to be this great adventure. That same darn tendonitis crept up again, and I couldn't do it. And we had to, throw the bikes on the train. We rode the train to Minnesota. I ended up riding a little bit in Minnesota, but nothing like what I was intending. And what it was a redirection. It was life telling me, or God saying, turn your energy. There's something else trying to happen here. You don't need to keep going in that direction. For those who are astrologically inclined, there was a Saturn element to this as well. Saturn has a way of saying, no, we're focusing over here now. And that over here ended up being an inner life, ended up being the spiritual path. And being successful in running at the time seemed like a tremendous fulfillment. But in the long term, it was not. It would not have been. And that is the key to understanding this element of thy will, not mine. It doesn't mean my will disappears or gets ground under the heel of a cruel fate. It means my will tunes into thy will. My will becomes thy will. My will grows into a broader context of life. Other cultures do not worship youth. in the world. Many other cultures, I shouldn't say all other cultures, but a number of other cultures, including India and Oriental cultures, they tune into wisdom, the wisdom of age and maturity. And there's a sense of perspective, and that's part of why they tune into that. There's a broader vision of life. When you've had 60 or 80 or 100 years of life, there's just more experience. There's more of a sense of the rhythms of life, how they play out, the music of life. Where is it going? What does it do? What's it trying to communicate to us? We have to learn to listen. That's one of the keys to this topic. We have to tune in. And I don't know if any of you were confused or perhaps just not quite understanding Swami's little bit about awareness in the reading about the affirmation awareness. Become aware at the source of your awareness. Instead of becoming aware of what's outside of you, tune into your awareness at the source of awareness. Tune into your awareness, what you are aware with. I remember trying to translate that line into Italian, and it just absolutely defied translation. In fact, why don't you hand me the book and I'm trying to paraphrase, and it really deserves to be quoted directly here. Man needs to learn to change his focus from what he is aware of to what he is aware with. That was the line that we just couldn't get there in Italian. But being aware with, you are aware with awareness. And that awareness can focus on something outside. And Swami used the example of the jeweler in the eyes. But he was saying, tune into the source. That's where the joy is. That's where God's will is. It's deep, deep inside of us. And yes, it can be reflected outwardly. It can be expressed outwardly. But we have to learn to develop that skill, that knack, or that sense of tuning in and listening. Music, if you're going to sing in harmony, like the song that the choir is about to sing at the offertory is, Lord, may we serve you all our days, ever rejoice to sing your praise. As we your guidance with joy receive, may we as one your bliss achieve. There's this sense that we don't have to do it all. We don't have to create, in the example of a sailboat, we have to, if we're sailing across the ocean of delusion in our little personal sailboat, our job is to lift the sail. Our job is to steer the boat. Our job is not to blow into the sail and hope that our blowing into it will cause enough wind to get across the ocean. We're not going to get there. It's not going to happen. But we lift the sail and we tune in. We orient according to which way the wind is blowing. We can even learn to take that boat against the wind eventually if we're skillful enough at it. It takes a lot of sensitivity to do that. Life may be sending us a tide or a wind that seems directly opposed to where we're trying to get, but with God's will, we can overcome it. We can learn to work with it in some kind of harmonious way, and that is a gift, and it's a gift that we see in the lives of those around us. We have Lahiri's Murti in front here today. We celebrated his birthday and his Mahasamadhi, his conscious passing this past Friday night. But he gave us the example. In fact, the fact that we're all here in the room today at all, in many ways, is due to a simple act of his own surrender. He had gone to the Himalayas, he had met Babaji, he had received Kriya initiation, he had received cosmic consciousness up there. And as far as he was concerned, his outward life was over. He was ready to stay there. He was ready to live in bliss. He was ready to be with his guru for many lifetimes. And God's will turned. No, you have to go back to worldly life. You have to show people how to live in the world and have a spiritual life. Both of those things. It is not automatic. It is not a given in this world, but it is possible to do, and he showed us how. And that balance that we strike between the outward and the inward is something that all of us can learn to do better and more effectively, more deeply, more intimately, really, in a sense, because we're learning to tune into God as our own. It's not, God is not this abstract force out there that is not unattainable. God is our own. And when we tune into God as our own, then tuning into his will just becomes the most natural thing in the world. It may not always be comfortable, but in the long run we see, okay, yes, there is a flow to it. There is a grace and there is a blessing to it.